Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Rebecca Lawrence and this is Voices. In this set of interviews, I will be focusing on issues of inclusion, diversity and allyship through intimate conversations with wine industry professionals from all over the globe. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps us cover equipment, production and publication costs, and remember to subscribe and rate our show wherever you tune in. Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast with me, Rebecca Lawrence. Today we've got a fantastic episode for you because I'm joined by Nadine Brown, sommelier and wine buyer from Charlie Palmer Steak in DC. Welcome to the podcast, Nadine.
Thank you so much.
Before we get started, for those listeners who might not be aware of you, could you introduce yourself to them and maybe tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Awesome. My name's Nadine and I am a longtime hospitality wine professional in the DC area. I'm originally from Jamaica. I'm originally from Falmouth, Jamaica, a pretty rural town in northeastern Jamaica. I went to high school in Puerto Rico and then went off to college in Boston for social work. I'm a mom of two. Estelle is 4 and Emerson is 10. And we've been in this house together for about a year now. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
So I love that you came to wine after having started in another career. It's something that I did myself. I didn't start in wine. And I often like to ask people how that previous work has influenced what they experience in hospitality. So I was really fascinated to discover that you trained in social work and worked in the field before you switched to wine. So I wondered, how the move to wine came about, and also if perhaps your training in social work is one of the reasons why people often comment that you're very convivial on the floor, able to talk to anyone about anything.
That's a great question. I think a lot of people come into wine that way. Probably not so much anymore. I feel there are a lot of, 18-year-olds who know exactly what they want to do and go into wine right away. But yeah, I didn't do social work for a very long time, honestly, but it feels longer because there's so much field study while you're going through school and education. My mom was definitely instrumental. I think just she could also talk to anyone, from, people on the street to board meetings, and I think there's just that convivial. I think there's something just about the Jamaican culture too of welcoming people from all over the world and, that part of it. I think the soft skills, we've been talking a lot, I think the last couple of years, in all different fields, the importance of soft skills, whether it's even just business CEOs saying, I need people graduating who can talk to people and write and social work is a lot about listening. And I think to be a good sommelier or just hospitality professional in general, it helps to be a good listener. I always thought of myself as the translator. Like I'd listen to a guest telling me what, they wanted to drink, and then matching it up with a wine from my program.
I think you're right that's a really important skill is that kind of active listening. But I love how you talk about it as being a translator, because you've got to take whatever someone on that you're serving tells you and translate that into the perfect bottle of wine for someone. And that truly is a skill.
Yeah. And, and a lot of times they're giving you stuff in kind of garbled language. I'm doing quotes you can't see. I want a sweet, dry wine that's, floral. I'm like, well, that's not what you mean. But over time, you're like, okay, I know what you mean because, I've been doing this for a while and enough people have asked me for a sweet red wine to know, what style you're talking about. So absolutely.
Yeah, thinking about the language of wine. I read in one of the interviews that you've done that you'd much rather tell the story of a wine than give it a tasting note. And part of this, coming back to your kind of growing up in Jamaica, Puerto Rico, that some of the tasting notes that you experience and given by sommeliers don't really resonate with what you experienced growing up. I wondered if you thought this is something that more sommeliers need to tackle, and also perhaps other parts of the field like education.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's happening, definitely with sommeliers first. I think there needs to be a balance. The language of wine is there for a lot of different reasons. I know even at the restaurant I could meet someone from Germany or, somewhere where the language wasn't always there, but pretty much everyone knows what a raspberry is. And I always thought that and I always assumed that. But if you kind of draw back more, there's a lot of the world that's never had a raspberry, right? And it's almost easier for us in the Western world to get access to things, from other parts from the world than vice versa. So, does that make sense? Like I can go to the Korean grocery store here and find things, from Thailand, from all from India, as opposed to them, finding a gooseberry in Mumbai.
Yes.
that, I still haven't had a gooseberry, but I still think you should, if you're a wine professional, you should still, seek out, as someone from Jamaica, I made a point to, find figs and quince and gooseberries, which I still haven't found, because it's a joint language, so it's both people meeting each other, where they can. But I do think that's changing, in terms of testing there. I do understand the need for some uniformity, right? Because we can't have everyone, I think it was like Rioja, where the Italian American oak, I would say, oh, this smells like when they're burning the sugar canes in Jamaica, when they're cutting the sugar cane down to make rum. And that's not an experience that everybody has, right? And it's interesting, and people are like, oh wow, I can get that. But when you're doing WSET, like it doesn't really work in that sense.
Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting point in wine and wine education in terms of the language we're using, for many reasons, but also, this tasting note, because the gooseberry thing is something that kind of drives me a little bit mad, because it's used so often as this classic tasting note for Sauvignon Blanc, and as someone who's from the UK, gooseberries were just something I grew up with. But you slowly realise that a whole lot of the world just has no frame of reference for what this is, except for Sauvignon Blanc. So I think it's really interesting to start exploring, and yes, we've got issues with standardized testing, but exploring different ways of talking about wine. And when I heard about you talking about telling the story of wines, to give them the context rather than necessarily just going, oh, it tastes like this.
Yeah, I think that's what people remember. As a sommelier walking around the floor, I didn't, when I was talking to someone about wine, the things on the back of the label was not really what grabbed people's attention, hints of raspberries and cedar and, all of those kind of tasting notes. But the stories, there's a wine here called Groth from Napa that was started by one of the founders of Atari, which is an old gaming system. Frank Family is a cab, again, from Napa, and he was a Disney executive for a long time and started the Golden Girls. And, absolutely, actually, the Golden Girls is probably more universal than gooseberries, right? And people really, remember those stories. That's what I mean.
Yeah, and I also think that helps resonate with people, because many people want their wine to be an experience and a memory and a story that they then take on. So suddenly their experience of the wine becomes intertwined with the story you've told them, maybe an experience you've had with the wine, or maybe a particular experience about the winemaker. And that can all build in to create this great narrative of a wine. And you might not remember the tasting note, but you're going to remember the experience you had when you tasted it.
Absolutely.
So obviously, you have been involved in this world of service and hospitality, and you've spoken about the fact that it does present challenges, for, in particular, mothers or working parents. It doesn't have to just be mothers. And it must be incredibly hard to have balanced a job in the service industry, in hospitality, with children. I wondered, how would you like to see the industry adapt to make these positions something that's sustainable for parents in the long term? Because those of us who work in hospitality love what we do and want to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, I feel like I was fairly lucky. I was at Charlie Palmer for like 14 years, and that was part of the reason, not part of the reason why I stayed so long, but I had both my kids there, and, they were just very supportive in terms of time, time that I needed off, but I also, placed wine orders while getting sonograms. Like these are true things that that I happened. And I used to really talk about what restaurants and the industry need to do, and that stays the same, just in terms of being supportive and having conversations. I think it's really important to have conversations with your employer early on, both of you setting down with a plan, and even in the interview process, like, hey, this is something that's important to me, just in terms of your values. But pulling back a little bit, COVID has laid bare a lot of issues that we knew were there. So I don't think it's just a hospitality issue. I think it's, especially in the States, just something that we need to deal with on a more macro level, in terms of funding early childhood education. I don't think that just industry, and I don't want to get too political on it, but it's changed a little bit than when, before I'd say like restaurants need to do this and that, but I think it also has to be, on a broader level. I don't remember the statistic right now, but, in terms of people that are not back to work right now, more than, it was like 80% of them are women, and it's because of childcare and because school's out, and that absolutely, hurts the economy, and then just hurts women as well.
Yeah, I think there needs to be this, like you say, this broader discussion about how we make this kind of work-life balance more sustainable for the choices that people might want to make. And I completely agree that that's not just hospitality, and that hopefully one of the things that the current situation will do is make that conversation more prevalent and make us realize that perhaps changes need to be made in this very broad way, not just in particular circumstances.
Right. And the value, the value that we place on parents, and just how important that is.
Yeah, being able to make a parent present if they want to be, and as much as they want to be, whilst also balancing a career that they love.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I thought, I definitely thought about, leaving the industry altogether at the beginning of, but there's just been so much time, blood, tears, money.
The investment has already been made. So one of the things you have been doing is you've talked passionately about education and making wine approachable for people. So I wondered if you could talk to our listeners a little bit about some of the education initiatives that you've been involved in, and maybe the future of them.
Absolutely. I'm on the board of a pretty new nonprofit called the Verasion Project, where we're working to get more people of color into the wine industry, and just helping to, lower some of the barriers, whether it's funding for certifications, because certifications are expensive and continue to get more expensive, exposure. We've partnered with distributors where they give us wines to give to candidates for blind tasting, mentor a pretty intensive mentorship program, because there's also a lot of people think of becoming a sommelier, and that's great, but there's a whole industry, right? There's marketing and sales. And, I worked for a distributor. I went from the floor to sales for a short period before COVID. And it was difficult. In retrospect, I wish I had master classes.
I think that's super exciting, because that's definitely something that I have found missing as someone who came into wine a little bit later, without necessarily some of the skills that were expected of me as someone working in retail, because I'd just never come across it, and it was never touched on in my wine education. And having those masterclasses is going to be so useful for people. And like you say, the barriers to entry are also cost-based. that idea of being able to support people with things like wine samples for tasting, because a lot of these certifications require you to have blind tasting skills, but wines are expensive, particularly the further you get through the certification. So I'm super excited by what you're managing to do.
We just started an internship program too with Virginia Wines, getting people of color hired for intern jobs. So yeah, I mean there's some other great organizations, Wine Unify, the Roots Fund, that have done some amazing work in less than a year, in a short period of time. A lot of this was growing and happening, but to be real, the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement here in the States and then globally last year was definitely a huge catalyst of just kind of enough's enough, and people just wanting to do something, and us kind of looking around and, hey, we have all of this, these resources and people that have been in the industry, and it's long past time. So
yeah, it definitely is. And I really hope that out of such kind of tragic circumstances, the wine industry, but also, industries in general, can use that as a catalyst for positive change. We kind of have to. So speaking of education and what's next for you? Is it MSMW, or are you just trying to work on your own work-life wine balance?
Yeah, I kind of fell out of love with the wine, in terms of that intense wine study a couple of years ago. There's just kind of a mismatch between what I was studying, I think, and the floor, and then having kids and a mortgage and a dog and a fish. But definitely, getting interested in again, and MW. I'm going to start with the diploma. I need to finish the diploma. Is something that's interesting to me, and then the special, the French, just specializing, in particular regions, like French wine scholar. But I'm not sure. I'm also helping my 10-year-old, with decimal placings. So yeah, but just even if I don't do that, there's just always learning, and I'm doing some, starting to do some writing, and definitely reading more, and studying. I'm doing studying again in quotations, because of the writing, and enjoying it again, if that makes sense, and really, helping other people kind of find their way, giving back in any way that I can. I think it's important that people see people that look like them, doing what they might not even think was possible. It's something that I kind of organically knew was important, but maybe 2 years ago now, I was at a tasting and someone tapped me on the shoulder like, "Hi, Nadine, you don't know me, but I've been following your career, and you were kind of the first Black woman I saw, and made me, even think of this profession as a possibility," which is when it really clicked home that, all these terms we throw around like representation matters, but it does. And, I this is a whole, we could have a whole other podcast about this, but, the fact that I wasn't born here, that I was from, I was 20 when I came to the States, and everybody, in Jamaica, the prime minister looks like me, my teachers, the lawyers. So I didn't think there wasn't anything that I couldn't do. So yeah, so it's important, and it doesn't have to be. My early mentors were not people of color; they were really supportive. But I think that it does make a difference.
Yeah, I think it really does. And I definitely started in the industry where there weren't a lot of young women with coloured hair and tattoos, and that's a whole different thing to race, which, oh my God. But like you say, one of the reasons I started working in education was because I wanted to demonstrate that it wasn't just for one type of person. And I think that's even more important now, is to get as diverse a group of people on show to say, you know what? Anyone who wants to do this can do this, and we will find mentors for you.
Yeah. You can be a professional with blue hair. I think I saw a TikTok about that. It was excellent. And social media, I think more than anything, social media is what I've really been getting into the last year. before we started, we were talking a little bit about Clubhouse, and I've definitely been more involved in Instagram and just trying to reach people that way.
Your Instagram is amazing. It's so great.
Thank you.
I will get you to give your social tags before we end, but given this is the Italian Wine Podcast, I will be, told off by my producers if I don't ask a question about Italian wine. So you have traditionally been known as someone who is an American wine lover. Obviously, you have managed a list that was only American wines, but I was wondering if you could sneak an Italian into your collection, what would you choose?
Oh boy, there's so many, and Italy was always hard to study, I think, for a lot of people, because because it's not really one country, because I don't call the same grape the same thing. Like I'm having flashbacks right now. But, I did a tasting recently. There's a Chinese Korean restaurant here, and it was for the Year of the Ox. It was for Chinese New Year's. And I did a Scarpetto Barbera with it, and it was beautiful. And and then I've this past summer I really started having a lot of great Grillos from Sicily. So both of those, and those are just profiles, especially the Grillo that just you can't. There's nothing like it. You can't. I don't even know what to compare it to. That salinity. I love wine history, and there's just so much history in Italy. So I would say, a Barbera, or, something from Sicily, like an indigenous grape from Sicily. And Barbera is a weird, weird choice, but I think, I wouldn't start someone on Barolo, just in terms of, kind of depending where they are in their wine journey.
I think that's a great choice. I was actually talking to a guest earlier this week, and they also chose Barbera because it's a great variety that has so many different ways of expressing itself, because, they can be super easy drinking or they can be super complex and able to age. And I think it's a great grape to get people into Italian wine because it's easy to say, and it can be an approachable wine, but it can move through these layers of complexity. So, and it's the same, and actually the same with Grillo as well. Like you have super fresh, easy to drink, but then you have maybe some more interesting oxidized. Oh, I want a glass of wine now.
Awesome. And Moscato de Asti. I think Moscato gets a bad rap. There's some horrible ones, and just horrible, just bathtubs. I think they're just bottling it in bathtubs. But, especially we were talking about, expanding the lexicon and pairing wines with food people actually eat.
Yes.
Whether it's, I think, Moscato goes well with Jamaican food and, Puerto Rican pork and, it's really versatile.
Yeah, definitely Moscato with pork belly dishes. Amazing. Now I'm hungry and thirsty.
Me too.
So I think that's the perfect place to wrap it up, because our listeners are going to be desperate to get in the kitchen. Nadine Brown, thank you so much for joining me on the Italian Wine Podcast. Where can our listeners find you? Online, on social media, Clubhouse?
I'm still working on getting my website out for this new project I called At Your Service. But on Instagram at Nadine Wine Brown is the easiest way. It's Nadine Wine Brown on Clubhouse, but Nadine Wine Brown on Instagram, and my DMs are always open.
I encourage all of our listeners to go and look at Nadine's Instagram. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone for listening. Don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe, and of course donate on the website to make sure we can keep having these amazing conversations.
Listen to the Italian Wine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Himalaya FM, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps cover equipment, production, and publication costs. Until next time, chin chin.